So, Bradley, most PR professionals, we think of media monitoring as covering, traditional media, social media now, maybe stuff that's crawled across Google. Why do you think podcast monitoring remains a blind spot in most strategies? Is that just because it's audio and it's harder to track?
I think that's part of it. I think there has been hesitancy in general over its prevalence and cultural importance. Even last year, I think that's changed pretty drastically post-election in the U.S. And I mean, the last stat I saw that over 70% of Americans over 12 have listened to a podcast. So it's certainly prevalent. And then I think the second issue is just accessibility for data. And
the
so,
UK stats came out the other day, right? The
yes.
UK's starting to catch up. Canada, Australia, I think it's
Yes,
one
so
in
this is a
four.
global phenomenon. Everyone's listening to podcasts, and it's an all-time high for 2025. And there's over 5 million podcast feeds, and a lot of those feeds probably don't have much relevance to a PR professional. And figuring out which to prioritize and how to access, it's messy, and it's free, it's open, and so I think the data accessibility has been a huge stumbling block. And obviously now there's a lot more tools to work around that. So I think that's it. It's what is a podcast? What is this? And does anybody listen to them? And then, all right, this is important. Now, how do I action on that truth?
Now, Bradley, we've seen brands like Starbucks and Amazon, and they're just on it. They're using podcast data to shape both paid and earned strategies. Can you walk us through what this third dimension of analytics looks like and how it strengthens campaign planning?
Yeah, I think there's this interesting blending of earned and paid media, and podcasting offers this unique opportunity where a brand can analyze transcripts from the past, say, 30 days or 60 days. They can bundle that and those insights with demographics and metadata, and then do a topic breakdown and an analysis of here's how my brand is being talked about, and here are the hot button topics. Here's the top 3. 5 million people are talking about the perception of my brand negatively, and this is what the demographic looks like. Then you can take that data for underneath that topic and then target that audience for paid and influence them. And so this earned capability allows for a brand to kind of look around the corner and see opportunities to shape narratives, which is really, I think, unique and a cool way to look at it. And it's very, it's not reactive. It's very proactive. And this is, I think, fairly cutting edge.
And that's sentiment analysis, right? And is it different with podcasts because they're long form? When I do sentiment analysis on social or even traditional media, it's pretty, by comparison, it's pretty cut and dry. In a 40-minute podcast, even if I review the transcript, the sentiment can be all over the place.
Yeah, so the way we process that data is we'll take like a snippet, and then we will zoom out 5 minutes in the conversation, and that allows us to not only look at the sentiment of is this positive or negative, but in what context is this being talked about, whether it's like a labor issue or a branding issue. And so that zoom out ability, you can't do that on a tweet. It's just a tweet. And so there's this qualitative attribute to podcasting that I think is unique, whereas Twitter and a lot of the other social feeds are more of a quantitative, like, all right, it's this number of hits, it's really positive, it's really negative, but there's not as much nuance, to your point about being long form. That's the capability of long form.
And I hear it all the time. There's too many podcasts out there now. I think there's about 6 million out there. Podcast Index has about 4.5 million. Depends on who you listen to. I agree with you, though. We're in the pioneering days, right? There's been massive growth. There are barely 400,000 podcasts globally that are publishing on any kind of regular basis. For PR pros waking up and looking at podcasts, where are the opportunities? For some, it's about starting their own podcast or guesting on podcasts, or a service like yours, which is in part media monitoring that includes that sentiment analysis. Where do they go to do it now before it becomes saturated?
Yeah, and so we have a monitoring capability, but sort of our bread and butter is empowering guest pitching. We always say making your own podcast is great, and we encourage people to do so. It's going to be about 10 times more expensive than you think it will be to be effective. And so if you have that budget, awesome, go for it. But it's a lot easier to pitch a compelling spokesperson for your brand to get on an existing audience in a week versus months and hundreds of thousands of dollars per episode. So yes, that's the opportunity in our view. Guest pitching is very powerful. Our clients have pitched thousands of successful placements on podcasts and continue to do so every day. And you're right, there has been some consolidation in the industry, but for the most part, these podcasts, you can email them. You can email the host, you can email the producer. It's very accessible, and obviously, like a tool like Podchaser makes it easier to do that. That's the opportunity. Like you can't do that with legacy media. There's no like you can't just like email the host of a CNN show.
That's actually how your team caught up with us. They sent us an email. Yeah.
I think actually we were doing a webinar about guest pitching, and we did a live pitch of pitching me.
That's right.
And it took him 5 minutes, and like it's so cool. So yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about politicians. So you've got Gavin Newsom and then obviously, Joe Rogan has always been a thing. I mean, he's always had an immense audience. But I think, there was some sort of shift that happened when he had, in the run-up to the election, he had President Trump on his show. And then I think a lot of people kind of woke up to the power of podcasts. I think the rest of us have been tuning in for years, and it's part of our daily life. We always kind of knew how powerful podcasts were. But do you think that was a pivotal moment where actually there was a broader audience that leaned in and thought, wow, podcasts are consequential. They can change elections. Elections can change the world. And all of a sudden, podcasts just had this new framing from a nice to have to you just can't ignore it in the channel mix.
Absolutely. I have a lot of thoughts on this topic. I think from our vantage point, the amount of political clients that we've engaged with in the past 3 months is 10x what it was before. And so you're right in that the activation from political agencies, but also just agencies and PR firms in general has developed substantially. There's a stat, I think in 2024, that 1 in 3 Americans have changed an opinion or view because of a podcast. And so you're not only these influencers and podcasts, they're not just talking about these topics, they're shaping their audience's opinion. And I think short form video is another big reason why this happens. So like my theory, you form this sort of parasocial bond with your podcaster. The short-term platforms pick up on this sentiment on maybe the YouTube video you watched or whatever, or what you're clicking on or what you're interacting with. And then you essentially get these clips of Theo Von, for example, or whoever the comedian or podcaster is in your short-term feed. And it's like a targeted ad, but instead of selling a mattress, you're selling ideas and values and concepts. And people love it. And so this is much more organic and natural feeling than a paid TV spot. And there's just no better way to get to know somebody than an unedited interview of 3 hours of just being able to talk with no prep, nothing, no edits. So yes, I think this is a really exciting and powerful platform to communicate from. And it started as this sort of fringe thing that I think is, you could argue, I think quite easily that this is a better way to engage with voters than a debate on CNN, for example.
I know I've seen the stats that show podcast listeners tend to be, I think it's 2/3 have a university education, they make 6 figures or higher. That's the status. That's the today. As podcasts grow, I think that's going to change because they're becoming mainstream. Either way, how important is it to understand the audience of the podcast and then niche your messages? And the whole idea of messages, sorry, I'm from the world where you create 3 key messages and you do your interview. Can you imagine doing a Joe Rogan interview and having 3 key messages? It can't be done.
Can't be done. Yeah.
You got to have 1 million key messages. And so key message out the window.
Yeah. Key message is out the window and vibe is in. And
vibe is in.
This currency of trust and vibe are much more important than you saw through the campaign, these politicians just being lambasted for repeating their talking points. Like, you can't do talking points anymore because the distribution for clips like that is just too powerful and you get caught. So you have to be authentic, and you're right. Like the podcast audience profile tends to be college educated, a little bit higher income. I think that's going to revert to the mean as this becomes more Gen Pop in general. But I think it's good to know that people who are listening to a podcast tend to be thought leaders within the community. And so you're not only reaching, 18 to 34 male, highly educated, college, whatever, but also that community around that listener.
Just going back to the sort of people that listen to podcasts and tune in, do they tend to be sort of overachievers? People who, for instance, want to learn something whilst they're washing the dishes or mowing the lawn, and they just want to sort of soak in knowledge when they have to do, I don't know, like I listen to the podcast when I walk my dog, and I sort of feel like I'm being really efficient with my time. It's a sort of slightly type A sort of approach. So I just wanted to ask, if you sort of, do people just listen to the podcast but not actually do anything else, or are most people like me sort of walking the dog and brushing my hair and God knows what?
There's a couple groups, and I think it has less to do with the listener and more with the content. But in general, it is this like in between time, whether it's a commute or doing a chore, where you are engaging with a podcast. But then there's also the folding the laundry and listening to Call Her Daddy in the background. Like you're not probably doing that to get up to speed on the latest politics, but you are hanging out with a friend. So again, that parasocial relationship is for more of those talk show formats. But in general, I do think the core demographic for like kind of the legacy podcast audience is these kind of brainiac overachievers who are trying to stuff as much knowledge as they can in their heads. I think that's going to change over time, but that anchor of that audience, I don't think will ever change.
You were saying key message is out the window, vibe is in. What's the vibe that you pre-established going into this interview? What's the vibe that you wanted to get out there? Give me a peek behind the curtain.
My vibe was, man, that's a great question. Guy from Oklahoma who pretends to know about anything around data and podcasting. That's a fun. I'm not actually from Oklahoma. It's a fun juxtaposition. I'm in LA. No, I don't know. That's my vibe. The Okie. Yeah.
Can I ask, Bradley, what is a vibe check? Because like my teenage daughter is using it and I'm too embarrassed to ask her. So can you kind of just let me in, and some of our audience who are the same as me have got no idea that this phrase being bandied about, what the hell does it mean?
I mean, I'm certainly too old to answer this question without being made fun of, but I believe a vibe check is based on mannerisms and the way in which a person speaks. Back to the point that Doug made about if someone's clearly regurgitating an internal script, that's not going to pass a vibe check. And so you pick up on a vibe check, I think, within seconds. Just like meeting somebody and shaking their hand, looking them in the eye. You can get that on an audio interview, but also especially on these video interviews as well. So
is it like chemistry?
That's a vibe check.
Is it like a chemistry test? Like,
yeah.
Okay. So
absolutely.
If someone goes out on a date and, people often say within, I don't know, a minute, they know if that person's right or wrong. And that's just that instant, chemistry that they feel. So a vibe check is just extended outside of the romantic realm to business colleagues and everyone else.
And it's a good point, because in a televised debate or traditional legacy media interview, you can't get a vibe check because it's rehearsed, it's scripted, it's you don't see the true person with their hair let down or whatever. But in a podcast interview, in a relaxed setting, I think it's much more organic, and so you can perceive so much more about a person in that setting than traditional media.
I think that's really interesting, because actually when I do broadcast media, I'm not very authentic, because I'm thinking I've got to come up with a soundbite. I have to think about it well in advance what that soundbite is, and I'm really worried about screwing it up. And also with broadcast media, especially when it's TV, it's literally like you have a minute, sometimes 2 minutes, and it's so fast paced. And you lose yourself. You're not actually yourself. Whereas in long form conversation, it's really hard to make the mask stay on. I think for a 2-minute, news, segment, you can put the mask on and keep it there, and be the sort of robotic expert called in talking head. But actually, when you're 2 hours chatting, that mask is going to drop. And at some point, you kind of forget you're being recorded, and you just start actually just being yourself. So I totally get why audience like it.
We see this phenomenon with hedge funds. They want to analyze as soon as possible whenever a CEO from a public company goes on a podcast, the data they can derive from just small tells or small words or sentiment on a podcast interview are a lot more important in many ways than an earnings call. And so I think you're totally right.
Can you give us an example of that without putting a client?
Yeah, well, if a podcast or if an executive from a public company goes on a podcast and is talking about a new product launch, they may I mean, we've had like the CEO of Microsoft and Google go on long form interviews very recently talking about the future of AI. And so if you're a hedge fund or fund in general, and you have a multi-billion long-term bet on AI, for example, and the CEO feels very confident and comfortable about nuclear power and how we're going to do all these things. Those insights and the confidence behind these topics that seem casual, they have these massive multi-billion-dollar impacts, I think, on confidence in a buy for a stock, for example.
So really, leadership becomes. I was going to say, so really, leadership becomes quite performative. So if you're a CEO, because some people are actually quite tense and nervous, and they could be absolutely an authentic person and live by their values, but they may just freeze up on camera or when they've got a microphone in front of them. And so when people say authentic, do they actually mean people who appear to be authentic as opposed to people who naturally are?
Yeah, I think so. I think podcasting is unique in that it feels much more casual, and I think people who get really nervous speaking probably, again, within a few minutes of a podcast interview, feel very comfortable. But you raise a good point that the importance of long form conversation from an executive is probably higher than it was in the past when you just had a script in an earnings call and you could just get through the thing and throw up later. So yeah, I think it could be described as performative, but I think maybe it's just an indication that it's a skill set that is maybe more important than it was in the past.
If you're a PR team, you're just starting to look at podcast analytics and activation, what's the one practical first step that someone can take today? And I guess the one mistake that they should avoid, the thing that everybody steps in.
Wouldn't it be nice if there was a SaaS tool that just distilled all this information down into one place?
If only.
Well, guess what?
Do you know one?
I do. It's called Podchaser Pro. So obviously our tool is made to solve these problems, but I think the opportunity, again, guest pitching is a big opportunity, and insights and analytics for your clients as well, monitoring how they're being talked about, and then taking action and being that sort of expert for your client in podcasting and using data tools to enable that expertise. What I would avoid is spray and pray. You'll get blacklisted. Your domain will get blacklisted very quickly from these podcast inboxes, their email inboxes. And then once you get reported as spam, I mean, it's really hard to recover from that. And then you have a reputational risk. So developing relationships with podcasters in specific verticals for your clients is how to do it. So it's just like traditional PR. You pick up the phone or send out the email to your tech interviewer person and say, hey, I have a tech spokesperson. It's me again. They're about to release a book. They're about to launch a product, whatever. And you're wanting to provide value to the podcast audience. And so if you have these data-backed pitches that you know are going to provide value, it shouldn't feel as if you're pitching. It should feel more like a relationship with the podcaster.
Perfect. Bradley, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. It's fun.